68 pounds. That was all she was. A 24-year-old woman reduced to 68 pounds of hollow bones and sunken cheeks, standing in the January rain of a place called Mississippi that she had only seen on maps before the war made maps irrelevant. The number came from the camp physician who had weighed each of the 23 German women as they stumbled off the transport truck that cold afternoon of January 12, 1945. He had written it on a clipboard with a hand that trembled slightly, then looked at Anneliese Richter with eyes that held something she had not seen in a very long time. Not hatred, not triumph, something closer to sorrow. The rain turned the red clay roads of Camp McCain into rivers of rust-colored mud that clung to their boots and the hems of their grey auxiliary uniforms. Those uniforms hung on frames that had grown thin during the 4 months crossing the Atlantic in the belly of a ship, during the weeks before that in a processing facility in France, during the months before that serving the Wehrmacht as radio operators and clerks and medical assistants in a war that was now clearly devastatingly lost. Anneliese stood at attention in the wooden barracks that smelled of fresh pine and damp wool. Around her, 22 other women stood in a line that was straighter than any of them felt. Captain Evelyn Donnelly walked slowly past them, her boots clicking against the floorboards with the precise rhythm of someone who had spent the previous week studying protocols for a situation no one had really prepared for. How do you handle enemy women? The manuals said one thing. The hollow faces before her demanded something else entirely. Captain Donnelly was 35 with steel-grey eyes and a voice that carried authority without cruelty. She stopped at the front of the formation and addressed them through an interpreter, a young private who spoke German with a thick American accent that made the words sound both familiar and foreign at once. You will be assigned work duties beginning tomorrow. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Adequate food. Anneliese felt something stir inside her chest at those words, something that was not quite hope, because hope required more energy than she currently possessed. She clutched the small canvas bag that contained everything she owned in the world. 2 photographs, their edges worn soft from handling, a prayer book with pages thin as onion skin, and a single letter from her mother, dated April 1944, the last communication that had reached her before the mail stopped coming, before the silence that was somehow worse than bad news. The photographs were of her family. Her mother Helena standing in front of their apartment building near the Ulster in Hamburg, her hand raised to shield her eyes from the sun, and her younger sister Clara caught mid-laugh at some joke. Anneliese could no longer remember, her mouth open and her eyes crinkled at the corners. Clara had been 13 when that photograph was taken. She would be 16 now if she was still alive, if Hamburg was still standing, if anything from before remained. Anneliese kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into her during training. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back severely from a face that had once been round and cheerful, but now showed the sharp angles of prolonged hunger. She had been pretty once in that unremarkable way of young women in peacetime. Now she looked like everyone else in this barracks, anonymous, depleted, defeated. That night, lying on a narrow cot that was somehow softer than anything she had slept on in months, Anneliese listened to the rain drumming against the corrugated metal roof. In the bunk beside her, Margareta Volkmann sobbed quietly into her thin pillow. Greta was 26, 2 years older than Anneliese, and had worked as a telephone operator in Berlin before volunteering for the Auxiliary Corps. She had not spoken since they arrived, but her crying said everything words could not. None of them knew what tomorrow would bring. They were prisoners in a strange land, thousands of miles from home, facing an uncertain future in the hands of people they had been taught to fear and hate. The propaganda had been clear and constant. Americans were brutal. Americans were godless. Americans would show no mercy to German women who had served the Reich. But Captain Donnelly had said adequate food. Anneliese's mind would not let go of those words. She turned them over and over like a puzzle with missing pieces. Adequate. What did that even mean anymore? She tried to remember the last time food had been adequate, the last time a meal had been something other than an exercise in creative scarcity and bitter disappointment. The memories came slowly pulling her back through time. Spring of 1942, Hamburg, The Richter family kitchen with its blue and white tiles and the copper pots hanging above the stove. Annalisa had been 21, then working as a clerk in the municipal offices, still living in her family's apartment, still believing the world made sense, and Germany was winning, and sacrifices were temporary inconveniences on the road to inevitable victory. Her mother had called her into the kitchen one morning, holding up their ration cards with an expression Annalisa had never seen before. Not anger, not fear, something worse. Resignation. "No more sugar this month," her mother had said quietly, her voice flat in the way that meant she was fighting to stay calm. "They've reduced it again, 50 grams per person, and even that's not guaranteed." Annalisa remembered laughing. Actually laughing, because it seemed impossible that sugar could just disappear. Sugar was as fundamental as air or water. You could not simply run out of sugar, and besides, the war would be over soon. Everyone said so. The newsreels showed German victories. The radio announced triumph after triumph. The newspapers printed maps with arrows sweeping across Europe. This was temporary. A month, maybe two, and the sugar would come back. She had been so naive then, so utterly, completely naive. The sugar never came back. By 1943, when Annalisa had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing she was answering her country's call to defend the homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy everything German, and good sugar had become a distant memory, something from another lifetime. In its place came the ersatz substitutes, saccharin tablets that dissolved into bitter approximations of sweetness, leaving a metallic taste that lingered for hours and made everything worse because they reminded you of what real sweetness had been like before you forgot. Her mother had tried making desserts with the saccharin, attempting to recreate the pastries that had once been Sunday traditions. Annalisa could still see her standing at the kitchen counter, measuring out the bitter white tablets with the same care she had once used for precious vanilla beans, her face set in determined optimism that fooled no one. The results were inedible, but they had eaten them anyway, chewing slowly and pretending not to notice the wrongness, the chemical aftertaste that coated the tongue and made the back of the throat burn. The memory that hurt most came from October 1943, Clara's birthday. Annalisa had been granted brief leave from her posting and had returned home to find their apartment smaller, somehow darker, as if the walls had drawn closer and the windows let in less light. The bombing had started by then, though not yet the firestorms that would come later, just enough to make every loud noise a potential harbinger of destruction. Clara had turned 16 and their mother had saved rations for weeks to make a birthday cake. When they cut into it at the small table that now held only 3 place settings, because father was dead killed in the Eastern Front 2 years prior, the interior was dense and grey, sweetened with saccharin and stretched with potato flour, because wheat was for the soldiers and sugar was a fantasy from a world that no longer existed. Clara had taken one bite, just one, and tears had rolled down her cheeks, not tears of gratitude, tears of loss. Loss for all the birthday cakes that had come before, the ones with real sugar and real butter and real eggs, the ones that had tasted like celebration instead of deprivation and desperation. "I can't even remember what real cake tastes like," Clara had whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Annalisa had reached across the table and taken her sister's hand, their fingers interlacing in a grip that hurt, and she had said nothing because there was nothing to say. She could not remember either. The taste of actual sweetness had faded from memory, replaced by the chemical bitterness of substitutes and the constant gnawing hunger that had become their normal state, the background noise of existence that you learned to ignore the way you ignored the sound of your own breathing. By 1944, even the ersatz sugar had become scarce. Coffee had long since disappeared, replaced by roasted acorns ground into a brown powder that bore no resemblance to the real thing. Chocolate was a fantasy from another life, something children asked about with the same wondering incomprehension with which they might ask about dragons or unicorns. Annalisa had been stationed in France by then, working in communications for an army that was retreating and fragmenting and dying, and even there in occupied territory, German rations were meagre. The French civilians they encountered looked at them with hatred, but also with a kind of grim satisfaction, as if they knew that the occupiers were starving too, that the machinery of conquest was grinding to a halt for lack of fuel and food and hope. The last letter from her mother, the one Annalisa carried in her canvas bag, had been dated April 1944. It was brief. Paper was scarce, and anything longer than a few lines invited too much attention from the censors. But between the careful, innocuous words about weather and neighbours, Annalisa could read the truth. Hamburg was dying. Food was running out. The apartment had been damaged in a raid. They were managing, her mother wrote, but managing meant something very different now than it had meant before. Nothing had come since. No letters, no word, just silence. Now lying in an American prisoner of war camp in a place called Mississippi, Annalisa tried to imagine what adequate food might actually mean. Would there be real bread? Real coffee? She did not dare let herself hope for sugar. That belonged to a world that no longer existed, a world before the war had stripped away everything sweet and left only the bitter residue of what remained. The rain continued through the night. Somewhere in the barracks, a woman cried out in her sleep, a wordless sound of distress that no one answered, because they were all trapped in their own nightmares, their own losses, their own fears about what tomorrow would bring. Morning came cold and grey. They were woken at 6 by a bugle call that sounded tinny and foreign, nothing like the military signals Annalisa had learned to recognize during her service. They dressed quickly in the same grey uniforms they had worn yesterday. The same grey uniforms they had been wearing for months through the capture in France and the transport across the ocean and the processing that had stripped them of everything except these clothes and the small bags of personal effects. After a brief formation where Captain Donnelly announced the day's work assignments, Annalisa found herself assigned to the kitchen facility along with Greta Lieselotte Schaefer and Frieda Hartmann. They followed Corporal Wade Brennan down a muddy path that wound between wooden buildings, their boots squelching in the red clay that seemed to be everywhere in this place. Brennan was 30 years old, with reddish-brown hair that showed hints of copper in the weak morning light and a scattering of freckles across his nose and cheeks. He had an Irish face, Annalisa thought, though she had never been to Ireland, and her only reference was a photograph she had once seen in a book. He walked with the easy gait of someone accustomed to physical labour, and he nodded at them with a courtesy that seemed genuine rather than mocking. The kitchen was housed in a large wooden building that smelled impossibly overwhelmingly of cooking food, real cooking food, not the thin ersatz soups and bread made more from sawdust than flour that had been their diet for years. The smell hit Annalisa like a physical force, making her knees weaken and her stomach clench with a hunger so intense it was almost painful. Inside, Private Emmett Harlow was waiting. He was 28, tall and rangy, with the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. Alabama, Annalise would learn later, though, Alabama meant nothing to her except another name on a map. He looked at the 4 German women with kind eyes and hands scarred from years of farm work, and he gestured toward the industrial stoves and preparation tables with a welcome that needed no translation. But it was not Harlow that made Annalise freeze in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. It was the abundance. Sacks of flour were stacked against the far wall, 50-pound bags piled 6 feet high, more flour than Annalisa had seen in one place in 3 years. Crates of eggs sat on metal shelving, real eggs with brown and white shells, not the powdered substitute that had been carefully rationed and tasted of chemicals and disappointment. Bins of potatoes lined one wall. Potatoes that were not half rotten or sprouting eyes or carefully portioned, but just there, available ordinary. And on an open shelf, sitting as casually as if they were of no particular value, were bags of sugar. 50-pound bags of actual white sugar. The real thing, not saccharin tablets or chemical substitutes, but genuine crystalline sugar that caught the light from the windows and gleamed like snow. Liesel made a small sound in her throat, barely audible. She was 23, the youngest of them, and her family had owned a bakery in Munich before the war. She stared at the flour and sugar with an expression that was close to physical pain. Beside her, Frieda Hartmann stood very still. Frieda was 27, a trained nurse who had served in military hospitals, and she was calculating in the way nurses calculated. Looking at the four of them, all underweight, all showing signs of prolonged malnutrition, and then looking at the abundance surrounding them. The cognitive dissonance was too much to process. Greta's hands trembled as she gripped the strap of her small bag. Her face had gone pale. Annalisa forced herself to look away from the sugar, focusing on Private Harlow, who was explaining their duties through a combination of halting German phrases and hand gestures. Peeling potatoes, washing dishes, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. Simple tasks, work she could do. But her mind kept returning to those bags of sugar. One bag, just one, contained more sugar than her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had seen in the past 2 years. More sugar than her mother had been able to obtain with ration cards and careful hoarding and connections built over a lifetime. More sugar than Clara had tasted since her 13th birthday. The wrongness of it was staggering. The sheer casual abundance. The waste. She watched as Harlow pulled out ingredients for the morning meal, cracking a dozen eggs without counting them, adding butter to a pan with a generous hand that suggested there was more butter where that came from, always more. When some flour spilled onto the floor, he simply swept it away with a broom, rather than carefully gathering every precious grain, the way her mother would have done, the way anyone in Germany would have done, because flour was currency and sustenance and survival. The four women worked in silence, their hands moving automatically through tasks they had done countless times before. Peeling potatoes, washing dishes in water that was hot and plentiful, chopping vegetables that were fresh and unblemished. The work was not difficult. The work was almost meditative in its simplicity. But the abundance surrounding them made every movement feel surreal, as if they had stepped into some alternate version of reality where the war had never happened, and resources were infinite, and food was just food, rather than the thing you thought about every waking moment. At noon, Corporal Brennan brought them plates of food for their lunch break. The plates contained more calories than Annalisa had typically eaten in an entire day back in Germany. Real bread, the kind made from actual wheat flour with a crust that crackled and an interior that was soft and slightly sweet. Butter, real butter, yellow and rich, not the grey fat substitute that had replaced it years ago. Vegetable soup that was thick with ingredients, chunks of carrot and potato and onion swimming in a broth that had depth and flavour. And coffee. Real coffee that smelled like coffee and tasted like coffee, and not like the roasted acorns they had been pretending was coffee for longer than Annalisa wanted to remember. They ate in silence. Each bite was a reminder of everything they had lost, everything their country had been unable to provide, while promising victory and demanding sacrifice. Each swallow was an acknowledgement of defeat that went deeper than military surrender. This was the abundance of the enemy. This was what the other side had been eating while Germany starved. Annalisa chewed slowly, tasting the bread, feeling the butter, coat her tongue with a richness that was almost overwhelming after years of deprivation. The coffee burned, going down hot and bitter and perfect, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes but forced them back. She would not cry over bread and coffee. She would not give them that. But across the table, Liesel was crying silently, tears rolling down her cheeks as she drank her coffee, and Annalisa understood. It was not gratitude, it was grief. Grief for all the meals that should have been like this, all the ordinary mornings that should have included real coffee and real bread, all the birthdays and Sundays and simple weekday breakfasts that had been replaced by scarcity and substitutes, and the slow grinding awareness that the world was broken and would not be fixed in their lifetimes. The afternoon brought a change that would alter everything. Sergeant Boone Calloway arrived in the kitchen carrying 2 large boxes, setting them down on the preparation table with a solid thunk that made all 4 women look up from their work. Calloway was 32 from Tennessee, with a handlebar moustache that would have looked comical in other circumstances, but somehow suited his weathered face. He had a slow way of speaking, a drawl that stretched vowels and softened consonants, and a reputation among the guards for fairness that Annalisa would only learn about later. He opened the boxes, and the smell that emerged made Annalisa grip the edge of the counter to keep her balance. Doughnuts. Dozens of golden brown rings, their surfaces glazed with sugar that caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen windows. The baker's wife in town had made extras for the camp. Calloway explained to Harlow, figuring the boys would appreciate something sweet. The smell was beyond anything Annalisa could have imagined after 3 years of deprivation. It was not just the scent of fried dough, though, that alone was enough to make her mouth water uncontrollably. It was the sugar, real sugar. The sweetness carried on air molecules, promising a taste that she had forgotten existed, a flavor that belonged to a world before the war, when sugar was ordinary and dessert was expected and food was pleasure rather than mere survival. She felt her knees weaken slightly. She tightened her grip on the table. Beside her, Greta had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the doughnuts with an expression that bordered on pain. Liesel's hands had frozen mid-task, a half-peeled potato forgotten in her grip. Frida stood rigid, her nurse's training the only thing keeping her upright. Sergeant Calloway noticed their reaction. He stood there for a long moment studying the 4 women, seeing perhaps for the first time not enemy soldiers, but hungry young people who had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. His face shifted, something softening around the eyes, and he reached into the box. He picked up one of the doughnuts, held it for a moment as if weighing more than just its physical mass, then walked over to where Annalisa stood frozen. "Here," he said, simply, his Tennessee drawl turning the word into 2 syllables. He held the doughnut out to her. "Try it." Annalisa stared at the offered doughnut. Her mind could not process what was happening. This was a trap, surely, or a test, or some form of mockery she was too exhausted to understand. Why would an American soldier share food with a German prisoner? Everything she had been taught about the enemy contradicted this moment. Americans were brutal. Americans were vengeful. Americans would not show kindness to people who had served the Reich. But Calloway's hand remained extended, patient, the doughnut still warm from the bakery, and his eyes held nothing but a simple human compassion that made no sense in this war or any war. Private Harlow nodded encouragingly. Corporal Brennan, who had returned and now stood quietly by the door, gave a slight nod as well. "Go on," Calloway said, his voice gentler now, almost paternal. "It's just a doughnut, ma'am. Ain't nothing to be afraid of." Annalisa's hand moved almost without her conscious will. She took the doughnut, feeling its weight in her palm, still slightly warm. The glaze stuck to her fingers. Actual sugar coating her skin. Real sugar. Not the bitter chemical approximation. Real sweetness. She looked at Greta, at Liesel, at Frida, seeing her own confusion and longing reflected in their faces. Then she looked back at Sergeant Calloway, who had stepped back to give her space, waiting with a patience that suggested he had all the time in the world for this moment. She raised the doughnut to her lips and took a bite. The world stopped. Pure crystalline sweetness exploded across her tongue, so intense after years of deprivation that she gasped. This was not the metallic bitterness of saccharin. This was real sugar, the kind that had disappeared from her life so long ago. She had almost convinced herself she had imagined what it tasted like. The dough was soft and rich, made with real flour and real eggs and real butter, ingredients that had become abstract concepts, words without corresponding reality. It tasted like Sunday mornings in her mother's kitchen when the world still made sense. Like birthday celebrations that actually celebrated something. Like ordinary afternoons when dessert was expected rather than impossible. Like a time when food was about pleasure, and not just survival, when sweetness was ordinary rather than a distant memory that hurt to recall. Tears rolled down Annalisa's cheeks as she chewed. She could not stop them. She could not even try. The doughnut was perfect, and the perfection was almost painful in its intensity, a reminder of everything lost and everything destroyed and everything that could never be reclaimed. But more than the sweetness, more than the sugar and butter and eggs, was the kindness. The casual, overwhelming kindness of an enemy soldier sharing something precious with people who were supposed to be monsters, who had served a regime that had brought destruction across Europe, who deserved nothing and certainly did not deserve this. It shattered something inside her. Some wall she had built to survive, some barrier between what she had been taught and what she was experiencing, some fundamental belief about how the world worked and who was good and who was evil. How could people who shared their food so freely be the monsters from the propaganda posters? How could soldiers who showed kindness to prisoners be the ruthless enemies she had been taught to fear? She finished the doughnut, licking the sugar from her fingers with a desperation that shamed her, and the shame only made her cry harder. While she stood here eating sweets given freely by enemy soldiers, her mother and sister were somewhere in bombed-out Hamburg, probably starving. Her mother, who had tried to make birthday cakes from saccharin and potato flour. Clara, who could not remember what real cake tasted like. Her family, who had given up everything while she had served a war machine that was now revealed to be not just defeated but fundamentally morally wrong. And here she was, crying over kindness from the very people whose bombs had destroyed her city, whose armies had crushed her country, whose victory meant the complete annihilation of everything she had been raised to believe. Greta began crying next, then Liesel, and finally even stoic Frieda's eyes filled with tears that she tried and failed to blink away. Sergeant Calloway looked alarmed now, clearly not having anticipated this reaction. He glanced at Private Harlow, who shrugged helplessly. Then at Corporal Brennan, who stepped forward and spoke quietly in his limited German, his accent thick, but his meaning clear. "Es ist okay," he said. "It's okay." But it was not okay. Nothing about this was okay. The kindness was not okay. The abundance was not okay. The realization that everything she had been taught about the enemy was a lie was not okay. Calloway did something then that Annalisa would remember for the rest of her life. He picked up 3 more doughnuts and handed one each to Greta and Liesel and Frieda, not with triumph, not with superiority, not with any sense of having won something, just with simple, uncomplicated compassion. "Go ahead," he said to all of them, his Tennessee drawl soft and unhurried.
"All of y'all, you look like you could use something sweet."
The 4 women stood together in that American military kitchen eating doughnuts in silence, while tears ran unchecked down their faces. Each bite was a reminder of everything they had lost and everything they had been told was evil about America. Each swallow was a question that had no answer. The propaganda had been so clear, so constant. Americans were godless. Americans were brutal. Americans would show no mercy. And yet here was mercy offered freely with no expectation of anything in return, except perhaps the simple acknowledgement of shared humanity. When they finished, Calloway left the boxes on the table. "More later if you want," he said simply. Then he left the kitchen, followed by Brennan, leaving Private Harlow to supervise the rest of their work shift. The women returned to their tasks in silence, but something fundamental had shifted. The work continued. Potatoes were peeled. Dishes were washed. Vegetables were chopped. But Annalisa's hands moved automatically, while her mind kept returning to that moment of unexpected grace. The doughnut had been more than food. It had been an offering of dignity, a recognition of their shared humanity, despite the uniforms and the war and all the propaganda that said they should hate each other. It had been proof that the world was more complicated than she had been taught, that people were capable of kindness even toward enemies, that maybe everything she thought she knew was wrong. That night in the barracks, Annalisa lay awake long after lights out. The taste of sugar still lingered faintly on her tongue, a ghost of sweetness that her body remembered, even as her mind struggled to process what it meant. The rain had stopped. Through the small window above her bunk, she could see stars, though they were arranged in patterns she did not recognize. Different constellations for a different world, a world where the enemy fed you, a world where kindness came from unexpected places, a world where 68 pounds was not the end of the story, but perhaps impossibly the beginning. The question that had haunted her since that afternoon returned insistent and unanswerable. If the enemy could be this kind, if the people she had been taught to fear could show such simple human compassion, then who had she been serving? What had she believed in? What did any of it mean? She had no answers. Only the lingering taste of sugar and the memory of a Tennessee sergeant's gentle voice saying it's just a doughnut, as if kindness could ever be simple, as if sharing food with the enemy could ever be ordinary, as if the world had not just shifted on its axis and revealed itself to be something entirely different from what she had thought it was. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more contradictions, more moments that challenged everything she believed. But tonight, in the darkness of a prisoner of war camp, thousands of miles from home, Annalisa Richter held on to one small truth. She had tasted real sugar again, and it had come from the hands of someone who should have been her enemy, but had chosen in one simple gesture to be human instead. The kitchen became a different place after the doughnuts. Not in any way that could be measured or officially documented. The work remained the same. The tasks were identical. Potatoes still needed peeling. Dishes still required washing. Vegetables demanded chopping for meals that fed hundreds of soldiers and guards and the growing population of prisoners who arrived weekly from processing centers across the eastern seaboard. But the atmosphere had changed in ways that Captain Donnelly observed with careful attention from her office window overlooking the compound. She watched the 4 German women who worked kitchen duty, noting how they carried themselves differently now. Straighter spines. Fewer flinches when American soldiers approached. Something in their eyes that had been absent before, something that looked almost like the beginnings of trust. It was February now. The Mississippi winter was mild compared to what these women had known in Germany, but they still shivered in the morning cold, their bodies too depleted to generate adequate warmth. Private Harlow had taken to arriving early to start the stoves, ensuring the kitchen was heated before they began their shifts. He had also taken to teaching them English. The lessons started informally, born from necessity rather than any official directive. Harlow would hold up an egg and say the word slowly. Egg, then flour, butter, sugar, salt, pepper. The women repeated after him, their German accents thick but their effort genuine. Annalisa discovered she had an aptitude for languages, the sounds coming more easily to her than to the others, and she gradually became the unofficial translator, bridging the gap between her fellow prisoners and the Americans who supervised them. Corporal Wade Brennan started joining them during meal preparations. He would arrive mid-morning ostensibly to check on supplies or coordinate with Harlow about evening meal requirements, but increasingly he stayed sitting on a stool near the preparation tables while the women worked. He spoke slowly, using simple words, and Annalisa translated for the others when his meaning was unclear. She learned that he was from Tennessee, from a farm that grew tobacco and corn in the rolling hills east of Nashville. That his wife Catherine had died 2 years earlier from complications during childbirth, taking their 3rd daughter with her. That his 2 surviving daughters, Maggie and Rosie, were 11 and 8 years old, living with his mother while he served out his enlistment. That he missed them with an ache that never fully subsided, that he carried photographs of them in his breast pocket, creased and worn from constant handling. The photographs showed 2 young girls with their father's reddish-brown hair and freckles standing in front of a white farmhouse with a porch that wrapped around the front. They were smiling, caught in a moment of ordinary happiness that seemed to belong to another universe entirely. "They're growing up without me," Brennan said one morning in late February, his voice carrying a weight that needed no translation. "Letters come every 2 weeks. Maggie's handwriting is getting better. Rosie draws pictures. But it ain't the same as being there." Annalisa understood the sentiment without needing all the words. Separation from family was a language everyone spoke fluently by now. She thought of Clara, 16 years old, somewhere in the ruins of Hamburg, if she was anywhere at all. Thought of her mother trying to keep their apartment livable amid the bombings and the shortages and the slow collapse of everything that had once seemed permanent. The women began sharing their own stories in return. Greta spoke about her work as a telephone operator in Berlin, connecting calls for bureaucrats and military officials, hearing fragments of conversations that hinted at truths the newspapers never printed. Liesel described her family's bakery in Munich, the way her grandfather had taught her to shape dough, the smell of bread rising in the early morning hours before the city woke. The bakery had closed in 1943 when flour became too scarce and sugar became impossible, and customers stopped coming because no one had money or ration cards sufficient for luxuries like pastries. Frida talked about her training as a nurse, her genuine desire to help people, the cognitive dissonance of working in military hospitals where she saved German soldiers so they could return to a war she was beginning to suspect was not the defensive struggle she had been told it was. Harlow and Brennan, and sometimes Calloway, who stopped by more frequently, now listened without judgment. They asked questions that were curious rather than accusatory. They treated these stories not as enemy intelligence, but as the ordinary experiences of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances beyond their control. It was during one of these conversations that Harlow decided to teach them how to make southern biscuits. "My grandmother's recipe," he explained, pulling out flour and buttermilk. "Been in the family since before the Civil War. Figure you ladies might appreciate learning something you can use later." Later. The word hung in the air, implying a future that none of them could quite envision. Later meant after the war, after repatriation, after returning to a Germany that existed only in increasingly doubtful imagination. Annalisa watched as Harlow measured out ingredients with the same casual abundance that had shocked her that first day. 2 cups of flour, half a cup of butter, a cup of buttermilk, 2 tablespoons of sugar. He mixed them with practiced efficiency, his scarred hands working the dough with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their size. "You try," he said, stepping back and gesturing to Greta. Greta approached the bowl tentatively. Years of scarcity had taught her to work with precise economy, using every scrap, wasting nothing. Her movements were careful, almost miserly, portioning out flour as if it were gold dust. Harlow shook his head, not unkindly. He placed his hand over hers and guided her to take more flour, more butter, working with generous portions that made Greta's eyes widen. "Plenty more where that came from," he said, gesturing to the supply shelves. The concept seemed impossible to grasp. Plenty more. These words had lost meaning during the war years, had become sounds without corresponding reality. But here in this American kitchen, they were simple facts. There was enough flour for mistakes, enough butter for learning, enough food that sharing it with prisoners did not mean someone else would go hungry. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and steaming, Harlow split one open and added butter that melted into the tender crumb. He handed it to Annalisa. "Try your handiwork," he said. The biscuit was delicious, soft and buttery and slightly sweet, everything a biscuit should be. And this time Annalisa managed to eat it without crying, which felt like progress of a sort. But the real transformation came late one morning in February, when Brennan arrived carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "Breakfast for the crew," he announced, setting the package on the preparation table and unwrapping it to reveal 6 strips of thick-cut bacon still warm from the mess hall kitchen. The smell hit Annalisa first. Salt and smoke intertwined, a combination so primal and perfect that it bypassed rational thought and went straight to something deeper, some ancient recognition of fat and protein and survival. The scent of the bacon caramelizing the edges, crisping, filled the kitchen and made her mouth water so intensely she had to swallow repeatedly. Harlow took over, heating a cast-iron skillet and laying the strips down with practiced care. The bacon sizzled and popped, releasing more of that intoxicating aroma. He cooked eggs in the bacon fat, 2 for each of them, and plated everything alongside the biscuits from the previous day's batch, reheated and buttered. When he set the plate in front of Annalisa, she could only stare. 6 strips of bacon, 2 eggs with yolks that ran golden when pierced, 2 biscuits glistening with melted butter, real coffee steaming in a mug beside the plate. She had not seen bacon since 1941. 4 years. Nearly half a decade since meat had been anything other than carefully rationed portions of questionable origin, stretched thin and made to last through weeks of meals that were more vegetable than protein. She picked up the first strip. Still warm. The crispy exterior gave way slightly under her fingers, and fat glistened on her fingertips. She raised it to her mouth. The first bite was a revelation that rewrote every meal she had eaten in the past 4 years. The crispy edge shattered between her teeth with a crunch that was audible, satisfying in a way that transcended taste. Then came the melt. The fat coated her tongue like warm silk, rich and smooth and perfect. Salt hit first, intense and clean, exactly the amount needed, and not a grain more. Then the richness of the fat itself coating her throat, her mouth, the inside of her cheeks, with a luxurious thickness that her body recognized as calories, as energy, as fuel for living. Beneath the salt and fat was a subtle sweetness from the sugar cure, a complexity that elevated the bacon from simple meat to something approaching art. She ate slowly, methodically, working through all 6 strips. The texture varied from crispy to tender, each bite offering something different. The fat melted at body temperature, coating her tongue and throat and leaving a richness that lingered between bites. She could feel the calories entering her system, could feel her depleted body responding to the sudden influx of fat and protein with something close to gratitude. The eggs came next, fried in bacon fat, their yolks rich and orange and perfect. The biscuits soaked up the runny yolk and bacon grease, becoming vehicles for flavor that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. For those 8 minutes of eating, the war did not exist. Hamburg did not exist. The past did not exist. There was only bacon and eggs and biscuits and coffee, only salt and fat and richness, only the primal satisfaction of eating food that was abundant and delicious and freely given. And then, as she swallowed the last bite, the guilt crashed over her like a wave. Her mother was somewhere in Hamburg, probably subsisting on ersatz soup made from water and vegetable scraps, if she was lucky. Clara, 16 years old, was probably getting 500 calories a day if the rations had not been cut further. Her neighbors, her friends, everyone she had left behind was starving while she sat in an enemy kitchen eating bacon. 6 strips. She had just consumed approximately 300 calories of pure fat, more richness in one meal than most Germans saw in a week. Frieda, sitting across the table, noticed the change in Annaliese's expression. "You all right?" she asked quietly in German. Anneliese shook her head, tears welling despite her best efforts to contain them. "My mother is dying of hunger," she whispered, "and I'm eating bacon." Brennan, sitting nearby, did not understand the German words, but he understood the tone. He understood guilt when he saw it. He said nothing. Just let Annalise process the contradiction of survival and shame, the impossible weight of eating well while everyone you loved starved. Later, after the breakfast plates had been cleared and work had resumed, Annalise found she could still taste the bacon, still feel the coating of fat on her tongue. The taste was perfect and terrible in equal measure. March brought the mail. There was a Red Cross system in place allowing prisoners of war to receive censored correspondence from family members. Every day at 1400 hours, a list of names was posted outside the administration building. Every day, Annalise checked the list. Every day, there was nothing. No letters from her mother, no word from Clara. Just silence stretching back to April 1944, nearly a year of not knowing whether they were alive or dead, whether Hamburg still stood, whether the apartment near the Ulster still existed in any form other than rubble. Brennan noticed her hope fading with each empty mail call. One afternoon in late March, he sat with her after she had returned from checking the list yet again. "Your family in Hamburg?" he asked. She nodded. "My mother and my sister Clara. She's 16 now. I haven't heard from them since April last year." Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I lost my Catherine 2 years back. Childbirth complications. Sometimes the not knowing is harder than knowing even when the knowing is bad. At least you can grieve what's certain." "Do you get letters from your daughters?" "Every 2 weeks, regular as clockwork. My mother makes sure of it. Maggie writes about school. Rosie draws pictures of the farm, the chickens, the tobacco plants. They're growing up without me, and all I got is letters and photographs and the hope I'll get back before they're grown and gone." It was the most he had said about his family in one conversation. Annalise heard the pain beneath the words, the same pain she carried. Different circumstances, same weight. Both of them separated from the people they loved. Both of them missing years that could not be reclaimed. She had started writing letters to Clara, filling a small notebook with words in German that she never mailed. She wrote about the doughnut, about the bacon, about the kindness of Americans who should have been enemies. She wrote about the guilt of eating well while her family starved. She wrote apologies that could never be adequate. "Liebling Clara," one entry began, "I eat well while you starve. I am so sorry, so very sorry. I do not deserve this abundance. I do not deserve to survive when you suffer. Please forgive me for living." The letters piled up unsent, because she did not know if Clara was alive to read them, did not know any address that might still exist, did not know if Hamburg was still standing or had been bombed into oblivion like so many other German cities. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. Then, on March 28th, The Red Cross bulletin board posted new information that made the not knowing infinitely worse. Hamburg had been bombed in July 1943. Operation Gomorrah, the Americans called it. A series of raids that created firestorms hot enough to melt asphalt, to suck the oxygen out of underground shelters, to kill 40,000 people in a single week. Annaliese's neighborhood was listed among the areas of heaviest destruction. She stood in front of the bulletin board, staring at the typewritten list of destroyed districts, and her mind refused to process the information. 40,000 dead. Her neighborhood destroyed. July 1943. That was 8 months before her mother's last letter in April 1944. So maybe they had survived. Maybe they had relocated. Maybe the letter had come from somewhere else. Or maybe her mother had written that letter from the ruins, from a partially standing apartment, from the wreckage of everything they had known, and then died in a subsequent raid. There was no way to know. Annalise ran from the bulletin board, her vision blurring, her breath coming in short gasps that would not fill her lungs properly. She made it behind the barracks before her legs gave out, and she collapsed against the wooden wall, hyperventilating, unable to get enough air. Brennan found her there 10 minutes later. He sat down beside her without speaking, just his presence, solid and calm. Eventually, her breathing slowed enough for words. "They might be dead," she gasped. "I wasn't there. I was part of the machine that... While they died, I was typing messages and transferring communications and believing we were defending the fatherland." "You didn't drop the bombs," Brennan said quietly. "You were a clerk. You didn't make the war." "Then whose fault is it I wore the uniform? I believed the lies. I served them willingly." Brennan did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Believing lies doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. We all believe things that turned out to be less simple than we were told. How can I face my mother if she's alive? How do I tell her I served the regime that destroyed our city, that I'm alive and eating well in an enemy camp while she starved in the ruins?" Brennan handed her his handkerchief, worn soft from washing. "You can't carry every sin of your country. Those who did the worst things, they're not you. You can't take on their guilt. But you can choose what you do next." The words offered no comfort, but they were honest, and honesty was something Annalise had learned to value more than comfort. April brought newspapers. Captain Donnelly made a decision that was controversial among her fellow officers, but which she believed was morally necessary. The American forces had liberated concentration camps in Germany, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Photographs were appearing in newspapers, images so horrific that many people refused to believe they were real. Donnelly believed the German prisoners had a right to know what had been done in their nation's name. She placed the newspapers in the small library room where prisoners could read during their limited free time. She did not force anyone to look, did not make a spectacle of the revelation. She simply made the information available and let each woman choose whether to confront it. Annalise chose to look. She sat alone at a wooden table, the newspaper spread before her, and tried to comprehend photographs that her brain could not process. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow with suffering that made her own wartime hunger seem trivial. Piles of emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Crematoria, gas chambers, industrial murder on a scale that defied comprehension. The article described places called Buchenwald and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen camps that had existed within Germany itself, within the country she had lived in and served, while she had believed the propaganda about defensive war and protecting the fatherland from enemies who wanted to destroy German culture. Greta found her there, trembling as she read. "Anna," she whispered, using the name that had become shorthand between them. "Is this real? Did we really do these things?" The other women gathered around the newspaper, their faces reflecting the same horror and disbelief. These were not hardened Nazi ideologues, but ordinary young women who had joined auxiliary services, believing they were answering their country's call to defense. Now they confronted the possibility that they had been part of something monstrous beyond imagination. Liesel began sobbing great heaving cries that shook her entire body. "My brother was SS," she gasped. "He told me he was doing administrative work. What if he was part of this?" Frida put her arms around Liesel, but her own face was ashen. She had served in military hospitals tending wounded German soldiers, helping them heal so they could return to fight. Had every bandage she wrapped, every soldier she saved been in service of these atrocities? Annalisa stared at the photographs until they blurred, trying to reconcile the country she thought she knew with the evidence before her. How could this have happened inside Germany without anyone knowing? How could camps exist? Could millions die while she typed messages and believed in victory? But even as she asked the questions, she knew the answer. The propaganda had been thorough. The lies had been convincing. The truth had been carefully hidden behind layers of euphemism and misdirection. And people like her, ordinary people who wanted to believe their country was good and their cause was just, had chosen not to look too closely at the contradictions, the disappearances, the whispered rumors that never quite became facts. That evening, Annalisa could not eat. The dinner that had been prepared sat in front of her, abundant as always, but it tasted like ashes. Not because of what the food was, but because of what it represented. How could she accept kindness from Americans when her own country had committed horrors she could not begin to fathom? How could she taste sugar and feel grateful when millions had died in camps she never knew existed? Brennan found her sitting alone outside the mess hall, her head in her hands. He sat down beside her, saying nothing at first. Finally, "You didn't know." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Annalisa looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known. How could I not know I served them? I was part of it." "You were a clerk, a girl doing what she thought was right, what she was told was defending her home. The people who ran those camps, who made those decisions, who carried out those murders, that's not you." "Then who?" "Someone has to be responsible. If not me, then who?" Brennan was quiet for a long time. The ones who gave the orders. The ones who built the camps. The ones who turned people into numbers and decided some lives weren't worth living. Those people carry that weight. You carry enough just being human in a time like this. It was small comfort, and Annalisa was not sure she believed it. But Brennan's presence helped his quiet acceptance of her confusion and guilt. His refusal to judge or condemn or demand answers she did not have. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Across America, celebrations erupted in streets and town squares. People danced and cried and embraced strangers. The long nightmare was finished. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, the mood was far more complicated. Captain Donnelly called an assembly of all German prisoners in the main hall. She stood before them with official documents from the War Department, her expression both professional and compassionate. "Ladies," she began, speaking slowly, so the interpreters could keep pace. "The war in Europe has ended. Germany has surrendered. Arrangements are being made for the repatriation of German prisoners of war. Within the next month, you will be transported back to Germany and released to return to your homes." The words should have brought relief, even joy. Freedom. Home. The end of captivity. But as Annalisa translated Donnelly's announcement into German for those whose English was still limited, she saw no celebration in the faces around her. Instead, she saw fear, uncertainty, and something that looked almost like grief. What homes were they returning to? Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was divided among the Allied occupiers. Munich had been bombed repeatedly. The Germany they had left no longer existed, had been replaced by something broken and occupied and starving. Reports from Europe painted a picture of devastation beyond comprehension. Cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, millions displaced or dead. Starvation was widespread, worse than anything they had experienced during the war itself. The occupation forces were struggling to provide even basic necessities to a population that numbered in the tens of millions. And beyond the physical destruction lay something darker. Germans were being forced to confront their country's crimes. Those who had served the Reich in any capacity faced suspicion, shame, and in some cases violent retribution from their own countrymen who blamed them for the catastrophe. Women who had served in auxiliary roles were particularly vulnerable, seen as collaborators, even though their service had been clerical and support-based rather than combat-related. That night, after lights out, 4 women huddled together in the darkness of the barracks, speaking in hushed German. "I don't want to go back," Greta said quietly, voicing what they had all been thinking but were afraid to say aloud. "My entire family is dead. My city is destroyed. What is there to return to?" Liesel nodded, tears in her eyes. "We'll be seen as failures, as soldiers who were captured by the enemy. They'll say we were corrupted by American propaganda."
They'll ask why we look healthier than when we left.
Frida, always the most practical, spoke what seemed impossible. "What if we asked to stay?" The words hung in the darkness like something dangerous and forbidden. Prisoners of war did not ask to remain with their captors. That was not how it worked. The Geneva Convention provided for their repatriation, not for their immigration. The very idea contradicted everything about how wars ended, and prisoners were exchanged and normalcy was restored. But as Annalisa lay awake that night, she could not stop thinking about it. Here in this enemy prison camp, she had found something she never expected. She had found dignity in her work. She had found kindness from people she was supposed to hate. She had discovered that Americans were not the monsters from propaganda posters, but ordinary people capable of extraordinary compassion. She had tasted sugar again, yes, but more importantly, she had tasted hope. Hope for who she might become, rather than remaining trapped by who she had been. The question was not whether returning to Germany would be difficult. The question was whether she had the courage to choose a different path entirely. The morning of May 22, 1945 arrived with a tension that electrified the air inside Camp McCain. Captain Donnelly had scheduled an assembly to finalize repatriation procedures, and the 23 German women gathered in the main hall with faces that reflected weeks of internal struggle. Most had accepted the inevitable. They would return to Germany, to whatever remained of their homes, to the difficult work of rebuilding lives in a country that had been physically and morally destroyed. But 7 women had made a different decision. Before Captain Donnelly could begin her official announcement, Annalisa Richter stood up. Her legs shook beneath her grey uniform, but her voice when she spoke was steady, each word in careful English that she had practiced with Brennan the night before. "Captain Donnelly, may I speak for some of us?" The room fell silent. Donnelly looked surprised, but she nodded. Permission granted. Annalisa turned to look behind her. Greta Volkmann stood, her face pale but determined. Liesel Schaefer rose, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Frida Hartmann stood with the rigid posture of someone holding herself together through sheer will. 3 other women whose stories had been quieter but whose suffering had been no less real also rose to their feet. 7 women in total. 7 women making a choice that had no precedent in the history of warfare. Annalisa turned back to face Captain Donnelly, aware of every eye in the room fixed on her, aware that what she said next would alter the trajectory of her entire life. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks." She began, her accent thick, but her meaning unmistakable. "Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." A ripple of shock moved through the assembled prisoners. Some of the German women looked scandalized. Others nodded slowly, understanding dawning on their faces. "We understand this is unusual," Annalisa continued. "We understand we are prisoners of war and that the Geneva Convention provides for our repatriation. But we are asking if there is any possibility, any legal way for us to remain in America instead." The implications were staggering. Captain Donnelly stood speechless for a long moment, clearly never having anticipated that prisoners would request to stay in captivity rather than accept their freedom. In the back of the room, Sergeant Calloway, Private Harlow, and Corporal Brennan stood together, their faces reflecting surprise, but also something that looked like quiet support. "I need to understand what you're asking," Donnelly said slowly. "You want to remain here as prisoners?" Annalisa shook her head. "Not as prisoners, Captain. We are asking if we can stay in America as displaced persons. We wish to work to contribute to build new lives here, if that is legally possible." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. The words she had rehearsed with Brennan, the words that felt both like betrayal and like the only honest thing she had said in years. The Germany we are being sent back to is not our home anymore. The country we served, we discovered, was not the country we believed in. Here we have been treated with more dignity as enemies than we had as citizens of the Reich. Her voice broke slightly on the last words, but she pushed through. Greta spoke next, her English less confident, but equally sincere. My family is dead. My city is rubble. In Germany I will be seen as failure, as person corrupted by enemy. Here I have learned what it means to be treated as human being. Liesel added, her voice shaking. You gave us doughnuts when you had no reason to show kindness. You taught us English, shared your food, treated us with respect. We do not deserve this generosity, but it has shown us the kind of people we wish to become. The silence that followed was profound. Donnelly looked at the 7 women standing before her, saw not enemy soldiers, but young people caught in circumstances beyond their control, asking for something that might be impossible, but was clearly essential to their survival. She saw Brennan in the back of the room, nodding slightly. Saw Calloway with his hand over his heart, his weathered face showing emotion he rarely displayed. Saw Harlow wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. This is unprecedented, Donnelly said finally. I will need to consult with the War Department, with legal officers, with immigration authorities. I cannot promise anything. The process will be complicated, possibly impossible. She paused, looking at each of the 7 women in turn. But I will forward your request, and personally, I will recommend it favorably. The following months became a labyrinth of bureaucracy and uncertainty. There was no precedent for enemy prisoners of war requesting to remain in the country that had defeated them. The Geneva Convention made no provision for such a scenario. Immigration law in 1945 had no framework for accepting former enemy combatants as displaced persons seeking citizenship. But Captain Donnelly kept her word. She wrote letters to the War Department, to immigration officials, to anyone who might have authority to make an exception to rules that had never contemplated this situation. She documented the women's behavior, their work performance, the transformation she had witnessed over the months of their captivity. Within Camp McCain, the 7 women faced opposition from unexpected quarters. Some of their fellow German prisoners were angry seeing the request as betrayal. One woman who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front confronted Annalisa outside the mess hall. You betray the fatherland, she hissed in German, her face twisted with contempt. Annalisa met her eyes steadily. The fatherland betrayed us first. The fatherland did things that cannot be forgiven. I cannot return to a country that committed such horrors. The woman spat at her feet and walked away, but Annalisa noticed that she was not the only one listening. Several other prisoners watched the exchange with expressions that suggested they understood, even if they lacked the courage to make the same choice. The local Mississippi community learned of the situation when a small newspaper ran a story, 7 German POWs choose America. The reactions were mixed. Some residents supported the decision, particularly those who had met the women through church programs or community events. Others were outraged that enemy soldiers would be permitted to remain on American soil. The Lutheran church in the nearby town offered to sponsor the women if their request was approved, providing employment references and housing assistance. The pastor, Reverend Henrik Larsson, was himself the son of Swedish immigrants and understood what it meant to build a life in a new country. Through it all, the 7 women continued their work duties in a state of suspended uncertainty. Every day, they did not know whether they would be forced onto ships back to Germany or granted the impossible chance to stay. Annalisa and Brennan spent more time together during these months of waiting. It was not romance, not yet. Neither of them had the emotional capacity for anything so straightforward. But there was a connection growing between them built on shared loneliness and mutual understanding of what it meant to be separated from the people you loved. Brennan taught Annalisa about Tennessee farm life, showed her photographs of his land, his tobacco fields, the white farmhouse where his daughters were growing up without him. He spoke about his plans to return, when his enlistment ended, to be a father again, to rebuild a life that had been shattered by Catherine's death. Annalisa told him about Clara, about her mother, about the Hamburg that existed in her memories, and the Hamburg that probably existed now only as rubble and ruins. She showed him the notebook where she wrote letters that would never be sent, and he read them even though he could not understand German, could only see the pain expressed in the careful formation of words. Then, in November 1945, a letter arrived from Germany. The Red Cross had finally delivered it. Postmarked Hamburg, October 1945. The handwriting was Clara's, though shakier than Annalisa remembered, as if written by someone whose hands trembled from cold or hunger, or the sheer effort of holding a pen. Annalisa opened it with fingers that would not quite cooperate, standing outside the administration building where the mail was distributed, unable to wait until she was somewhere private. Liebe Anna, the letter began. We thought you were dead. The Red Cross said you were a prisoner of war in America. Are you coming home? They were alive. Her mother and Clara had survived the firestorms, the bombings, the starvation, all of it. They were living in what remained of their apartment, 1/4 of the building still standing, sharing 4 rooms with 2 other families whose homes had been completely destroyed. Clara wrote about the hunger, about how they gathered coal from bombed buildings to heat a single room during winter, about how Mother worked, clearing rubble for occupation authorities in exchange for extra ration cards. She wrote about the silence where the city used to make noise, about entire neighborhoods that were just empty spaces now, about how strange it was to walk down streets where every 3rd building was missing. She wrote, We have so little here, but we have each other, and we thought we had lost you too. Please come home if you can. Mother cries every night thinking you might not survive to see us again. Annalisa stood in the cold November air, reading and rereading the letter until the words blurred. They were alive. But the request to stay in America had already been submitted. If it was approved, she would never see them again. Germany was poor, devastated. There would be no money for travel, no possibility of visits, no reunion, except in letters that took months to cross the ocean. Choosing to stay meant choosing to abandon her family. She found Brennan near the equipment shed organizing supplies. When he saw her face, he stopped what he was doing immediately. They're alive, she said, her voice breaking. My mother and Clara. They survived. But if I stay here, I'll never see them again. Brennan took the letter from her shaking hands, looked at the German words he could not read, and handed it back gently. That's not abandoning them, he said quietly. That's surviving. And they want you to survive. That's what families want, for the people they love to have a chance at a future. How can I build a future here while they starve there? By sending money when you can, by making something of the life you've been given, by not letting their suffering be for nothing. It was not comfort exactly, but it was honesty, and Annalisa had learned that honesty was more valuable than comfort. She wrote back to Clara that same evening, trying to explain in words that felt inadequate. She was safe. She was healthy. She had requested to stay in America, not because she did not love them, but because she could not return to a country that had done such evil. She promised to send money as soon as she was able. She promised to write every month. She did not mention Brennan. That was too complicated, too uncertain, too much to explain in a letter that would be read by her mother and possibly censored by occupation authorities. December brought the breakthrough they had been waiting for. A telegram arrived for Captain Donnelly from the War Department. She called the 7 women into her office and read it aloud, her voice carefully neutral, even as her eyes showed satisfaction. The War Department had approved an experimental program. The 7 women could apply for displaced person status under special circumstances. There would be background checks, required employment sponsorship, regular reporting to immigration authorities. They would need to leave the prisoner of war camp and transfer to civilian immigration processing. But they had their chance. Greta began crying with relief. Liesel embraced Frida so hard they nearly fell over. The 3 other women held hands and prayed in German, thanking God for mercy they had not believed possible. Annalisa stood frozen, unable to fully believe what she was hearing. This is not the end of the process, Donnelly cautioned. There is still much paperwork ahead, background investigations, sponsorship arrangements. but you have cleared the first and highest hurdle. You have permission to try." In January 1946, the 7 women left Camp McCain. They packed their belongings, which remained sparse despite months of accumulation. A few changes of clothes, personal items, photographs, letters, the small artifacts of lives that had been compressed into canvas bags and cardboard boxes. The goodbye to the other German prisoners was difficult. Some of the women who had opposed their decision now hugged them and whispered that they were brave. Others turned away, still viewing the choice as betrayal. But most simply wished them luck, understanding that everyone had to find their own path through the wreckage of war. Sergeant Calloway, Private Harlow, and Corporal Brennan were there to see them off. Calloway shook each woman's hand, his handlebar moustache twitching with suppressed emotion. "You're brave women," he said in his Tennessee drawl. "Proud to have known you, proud you chose us." Harlow gave them a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside were recipe cards handwritten in his careful script, his grandmother's biscuit recipe, instructions for making proper Southern gravy, a note that said simply, "For your new lives, make something good." Brennan stood apart slightly, and when the others had said their goodbyes, Annalisa approached him. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for helping me believe I could choose something different." "You did the choosing," Brennan replied. "I just watched you be brave." He handed her a folded piece of paper with an address in Tennessee. "When you get settled, if you ever need anything, or just want to write." She took the paper, tucked it carefully into her bag, and nodded because words seemed insufficient. The sponsorships were arranged through a network of Lutheran churches across the South. Annalisa was sponsored by a congregation in a small town outside Nashville, Tennessee, 90 miles from Brennan's farm. They provided her with a room in the church basement and employment as a translator for the local immigration office, which was overwhelmed with displaced persons from across Europe. Her German was valuable. Her English, improving daily, made her an ideal bridge between refugees and American bureaucracy. Greta went to a teaching position in Mississippi, working with immigrant children. Liesel found work in a bakery in Tennessee, finally able to use the skills her grandfather had taught her. Frida became a hospital aide. The other 3 women found various positions, all of them learning to navigate their new lives in a country that was both generous and suspicious, welcoming and wary. The letters between Annalisa and Brennan started in the spring of 1946. They began as simple updates. She wrote about her work, about learning to navigate American bureaucracy, about the strangeness of being free after so many months as a prisoner. He wrote about his farm, about his daughters, about the tobacco crop and the challenges of farming alone, but gradually the letters became more personal. She wrote about the guilt she still carried, about the nightmares that woke her, sweating and gasping, about the sound of planes overhead that made her flinch, even though she knew rationally that the war was over. He wrote about the loneliness of sleeping in a bed where Catherine used to sleep, about missing his daughter's childhood, about the weight of being both mother and father to children who needed more than he knew how to give. In December 1947, Brennan was discharged from the army. He wrote to Annalisa that he was returning to his farm, that his daughters were waiting, that he hoped she might visit sometime if she wanted to see what a Tennessee tobacco farm looked like. She visited in the summer of 1948. The farmhouse was white with a wraparound porch, exactly as it had appeared in the photographs. Maggie and Rosie, now 14 and 11, watched warily as their father introduced the German woman from the prisoner camp. They had heard stories but had never quite believed them. Annalisa cooked biscuits using Harlow's recipe, the one she had memorized and made hundreds of times in the year and a half since leaving Camp McCain. When the girls tasted them, still warm from the oven and dripping with butter, Rosie looked up with wide eyes. "These taste like Grandma's," she said, wonder in her voice. The ice broke gradually. By the end of the visit, Maggie was teaching Annalisa how to milk cows, and Rosie was showing her the best places to find blackberries in the woods behind the farm. In early autumn of 1948, Brennan proposed. They were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun set over the tobacco fields, when he spoke without preamble or romantic preface. "I'm not a romantic man," he said, "but I think we could build a good life together, if you're willing." Annalisa looked at him. This man who had shown her kindness when he had no reason to, who had helped her believe she deserved a future. "I bring a past I cannot erase," she said carefully. "People will judge you for marrying a German, for bringing an enemy into your home." Brennan shook his head. "People have judged me my whole life for being Irish Catholic in Baptist Tennessee. I stopped caring what they think a long time ago. I care what I think, and I think you're the strongest person I've ever met." She said yes. The wedding in June 1949 was small. The Lutheran church in the nearby town, the same one that had sponsored her immigration. Harlow travelled from Alabama, taking leave from his farm. Calloway came from Tennessee, his moustache now fully grey. Donnelly sent a letter from Virginia where she had retired saying she was proud of them and wished she could attend. Some neighbours did not come. The prejudice was real and would not disappear quickly. But Greta and Liesel and Frieda travelled from their new homes to stand with Annalisa. Maggie and Rosie served as flower girls, their acceptance of their father's choice a symbol of possibility. Annalisa sent photographs to Clara in Hamburg, the wedding, Brennan and his daughters, the farmhouse, the life she was building in soil that was not her homeland but had become her home. Clara's response arrived 3 months later. "I am happy you found peace. Germany is still hard but slowly getting better. Maybe someday I can visit and see this farm and meet this man who made my sister smile again." In September 1949, Annalisa gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, called her Ellie. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, healthy and full term and perfect. Maggie and Rosie doted on their baby sister. Brennan held her with the careful tenderness of someone who had lost children and knew how precious they were. Ellie was proof that redemption was possible, that new life could grow from the ruins of old wars, that people could choose to become something other than what history had tried to make them. In 1950, Annalisa became an American citizen. The ceremony was held in a courthouse in Nashville. She wore a simple blue dress, stood with 24 other immigrants from a dozen different countries, and raised her right hand to take the oath of allegiance. The judge, an older man who had served in the First World War, administered the oath with gravity and respect. Brennan held her hand throughout. Maggie, Rosie and baby Ellie sat in the front row. When the judge said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," Annalise felt something break open inside her chest, some final barrier between who she had been and who she had chosen to become. She was home, not the home of her birth, but the home of her choosing. The home built on kindness from unexpected places, on courage to choose differently, on the belief that people were more than the worst things their countries had done. But she never stopped writing letters to Clara, never stopped sending money when she could spare it, never stopped carrying the weight of survival when others had suffered. In a wooden box in her closet, she kept the letters she had written during her time as a prisoner, the letters she had never sent because they were too painful, too honest, too raw. Letters that said, "I eat while you starve," and "I am sorry," and "Please forgive me for living." She thought someday she might mail them, or burn them, or leave them for Ellie to find and understand the cost of the life her mother had built. For now, she kept them hidden. Evidence of guilt that would never fully heal, proof of a transformation bought with the currency of survival and shame, and the complicated grace of enemies who chose to feed her when they could have chosen cruelty instead. And for 25 years, Annalisa Brennan lived. She raised tobacco and children. She translated documents for immigrants who needed someone who understood what it meant to start over in a strange land. She made biscuits from Emmett Harlow's grandmother's recipe. She built a life in soil that was not her birthplace, but had become her home through the strange alchemy of choice and circumstance, and the small mercies that sometimes bloom in the ruins of empire. She had weighed only 68 pounds once, a hollow shell of hunger and defeat and broken certainties. She became whole, not healed, the scars ran too deep for that, but whole enough to live, to love, to raise tobacco and children, to make biscuits that tasted like home, even though home had moved across an ocean. She chose redemption over resignation, chose hope over despair, chose to believe that a doughnut shared by an enemy could be the beginning of a new story rather than the end of an old one. But the story does not end in 1950. 73 years later, on a warm June morning in 2018, Elizabeth Brennan stood in the attic of the farmhouse where she had grown up, sorting through boxes that had accumulated over 7 decades. Her mother had died 3 years earlier in 2015 at the age of 94. Her father Wade had passed in 1998. The farm now belonged to Ellie, who at 70 years old was finally working through the estate, deciding what to keep and what to let go. In the far corner, beneath a stack of old quilts, she found a wooden box she had never seen before. Small cedar, with a simple brass latch. No key, but the latch opened easily, as if it had never been meant to stay locked, just to keep the contents safe. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in German in her mother's careful handwriting, each one addressed to Liebling Clara, beloved Clara, the sister her mother had left behind in Hamburg. Ellie could read enough German to understand the dates. January 1945, February 1945, March, April, May. The letters continued through 1950, then stopped. None of them had ever been mailed. She called her mother's old friend that same afternoon. Lieselotte Schaefer, 95 years old, now still living in the small house in Tennessee where she had settled after leaving Camp McCain 72 years ago. "Liesel," Ellie said, her voice shaking, "I found letters." "Letters my mother wrote to Clara but never sent. Did you know about these?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Liesel's voice, still carrying traces of her German accent, even after all these decades. "We all wrote them, Ellie, all 7 of us. Letters to the families we left behind. Some we mailed eventually. Some were too painful to send. Your mother, she carried that guilt her whole life. The guilt of surviving, of eating well while her family starved, of choosing America while Germany burned. She never told me. Would you have wanted to know that your mother spent 70 years feeling guilty for being happy, for building a life here while her sister suffered there?" Ellie read through the letters that night, using an online translator for the passages her limited German could not pass. She read about a donut that tasted like hope and felt like betrayal, about bacon that was delicious and devastating in equal measure, about the impossible choice between homeland and redemption. The last letter, dated December 1950, ended with words that made Ellie cry for the first time since her mother's funeral. "Clara, you forgave me, but I cannot forgive myself. I eat well every day while you starved. I have a new family while our old family was destroyed. I chose a new country while our old country died. But perhaps this is my punishment to be happy and feel guilty forever." 6 months later, in December 2018, the Tennessee Historical Society opened a small exhibit called "The Sugar That Shattered Propaganda: One POW's Journey from Enemy to Citizen." The letters were displayed in glass cases with English translations beside each one. Photographs showed Annalisa at different stages of her life. 68 pounds in 1945, hollow-eyed and defeated, radiant in her wedding dress in 1949, holding baby Ellie with Maggie and Rosie on either side. At her citizenship ceremony in 1950, at the farmhouse in 1970 surrounded by grandchildren. In 2014 at 93, still baking biscuits from Emmett Harlow's grandmother's recipe. A replica of a 1945 donut tin sat in a case with a small placard. "This simple act of sharing food changed 7 lives forever." Beside it, Harlow's handwritten recipe cards, yellowed with age but still legible. At the exhibit opening, Ellie stood before a crowd of historians, students and community members. She held one of her mother's letters, the paper thin and fragile after 73 years. "My mother wrote this letter 73 years ago." She began, her voice carrying through the small gallery. She had just eaten a donut, the first real sugar she had tasted in 3 years. She wrote, "I cried not because of the sugar, but because of the kindness." Ellie looked up from the letter. That kindness didn't erase the guilt of serving a regime that committed unforgivable evil. It didn't erase the survivor's guilt of eating well while her family starved. It didn't erase the pain of choosing a new country over her homeland. But it gave her something she thought was lost forever, the possibility of becoming someone better than who she had been. My mother carried guilt her entire life. Every biscuit she baked, every meal she cooked, every moment of happiness on that Tennessee farm came with the shadow of those who had suffered while she survived. But she also carried gratitude and hope. She taught me that we are not defined by the worst things our nations do, but by how we choose to respond when we learn the truth. She taught me that sometimes the enemy's kindness can save us when our own people's cruelty destroys us. She taught me that redemption is possible, but it requires courage. The courage to choose a difficult new path over a comfortable old one. The courage to accept grace even when you believe you don't deserve it. The courage to build a new life on the foundation of an unexpected gift. Ellie looked at the photograph on the wall behind her. Her mother in 1970, age 49, standing in front of the white farmhouse. Wade beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Maggie and Rosie, grown women now with families of their own. Ellie herself, 21 years old and home from college. And in the front, 7 grandchildren, proof that life continues, that redemption is not just possible but generative. My mother weighed 68 pounds when she arrived at Camp McCain in January 1945, Ellie said. A broken woman in a broken world, carrying broken beliefs about who was good and who was evil. Then an American sergeant named Boone Calloway gave her a doughnut. Not because she deserved it, not because he was trying to make a point, simply because he saw a hungry person and had food to share. That one act of uncomplicated human kindness changed everything. It gave my mother permission to see the world differently, to question what she had been taught, to believe that transformation was possible. She chose to stay in America. She chose to build a life here. She chose my father, chose this farm, chose to become an American citizen. But she never stopped loving her sister in Hamburg, never stopped sending money when she could, never stopped carrying the weight of having survived when others had suffered. These letters, Ellie gestured to the glass cases around her, are her testament, not to her guilt, though that's here, not to her joy, though that's here too. They are her testament to the complexity of being human in impossible times, to the weight of choosing survival, to the cost of redemption and the grace that makes it possible. My mother is gone now, but her story remains, a reminder that even in the darkest wars, kindness is a choice. And that choice can echo across 70 years, across an ocean, across the chasm between enemy and friend. She weighed 68 pounds once. That's all she was. Then someone fed her. Not just food, hope. And she chose to live, and love, and build something good from the ruins of something terrible. That is her legacy. That is the sugar that shattered propaganda and built a bridge across a war. The exhibit stayed open for 3 months. Thousands of people came to see it. Many of them left notes in a comment book. One note written in shaky handwriting stood out. My grandmother was Clara Richter. She survived the war in Hamburg and lived until 1992. She kept every letter her sister Annalisa sent from America. She never stopped hoping they would see each other again, though they never did. She told me once that she forgave her sister the moment she learned she was alive. The rest was just geography and history. Thank you for honoring both their stories. And geography and history. In the end, perhaps that was all it was. 2 sisters separated by an ocean and a war, both trying to survive impossible circumstances, both carrying guilt and love in equal measure, both doing the best they could with the broken pieces they had been given. Annalisa Richter Brennan had weighed 68 pounds once. A hollow shell of hunger and defeat and broken certainties, she became whole, not healed, the scars ran too deep for that, but whole enough to live, to love, to raise tobacco and children, to make biscuits that tasted like home, even though home had moved across an ocean. She chose redemption over resignation, chose hope over despair, chose to believe that a doughnut shared by an enemy could be the beginning of a new story rather than the end of an old one. And in choosing, she proved that transformation is always possible, that people are capable of change. That kindness has power, even especially when offered across the lines that war and propaganda have drawn between us. The taste of sugar still mattered 73 years later, but what mattered more was what that sugar represented: the possibility of being human in a time of inhumanity, the choice to be kind in a world of cruelty, the courage to become someone new when the old self has been revealed as complicit in evil. A woman who weighed only 68 pounds, fed by an enemy who chose compassion over cruelty, transformed into a life that spanned oceans and decades and the impossible distance between who we are told to be and who we choose to become. That is the story of Annalisa Richter Brennan. That is the power of a doughnut shared in a Mississippi kitchen in the last days of a war that changed the world. That is what happens when kindness proves stronger than propaganda. And that is why 73 years later we still tell the story. Because some gifts are too profound to forget, some moments of grace too powerful to dismiss, some acts of humanity too significant to reduce to simple gratitude. A doughnut changed 7 lives. A choice changed history. And the echo of that moment continues, still reminding us that even in the darkest times we can choose to feed each other. And in that choice lies redemption.